Okay, so for part A, they want you to find out what f of -1 is. So remember that this is your input or your x value. So you need to look at your x-axis. And I have this x value of -1. And I want to look at the function. Now the function is what is sitting right here in blue. And so we want to see if you're given that x value of -1, what is your output or your y value? So then we're just going to go down here. And this is the point that is on our graph, and it has a corresponding y value of -2. For part B, it wants you to do the same thing, but this time it has an input of -2. So we go to -2, and we go down, and then we can see the corresponding y value, or the output is -3. Because again, this has coordinates -2, -3. The previous point had coordinates -1, -2. Okay, for C, it wants you to find all x for which f of x equals -1. So now this time, it's telling us this is our output or our y value, and which inputs are getting us that. So we got to look at the graph a little bit differently. So here we go. I'm going to erase my work from previous here so I can see a little bit better. And so I'm looking at an output. That would mean my y values, my vertical axis. And here I am at -1. And so I want to see where my graph is at -1. So I'm just kind of looking, here's -1. You can see my graph touches here. It has an output of -1 and here. So that's where there's 2. So the coordinates here are 2, -1 and 0, -1. So you can see my outputs are -1. And so the inputs that get me there are the 0 and the 2. So this is happening when x is equal to 0 and also when x is equal to 2. Those are the two inputs that get me the output. You can always have multiple. So when it says find all x, you can have multiple things that get you that output. Now if you look back at A and B, in order to be a function, every input has to have a unique output. So there's going to be only one answer for those ones. Okay, so for part D, they want us to again find all x, for which this time we're looking at f of x equal -2. So this time our output is -2. So I'm going to erase this work that we just had on here, and now we're looking at -2. So here's my y value, my output of -2. So I'm going to look and see I touch my graph here, and I touch my graph here. So this is the point 3, -2, and -1, -2. And so when we have an output of -2, it happens, and again, it's not always two places where this will be going on, but it happens when x is -1 and when x is 3. So again, 2 times where that's possible. Okay, now for part E, it wants us to find the x-intercepts. That's where you touch on the x-axis. So let me again clear out my graph. And so when I clear out my graph here, you can see that my x-intercept is where I touch the x-axis. That's happening here, and that's at 1, 0. So the coordinates of that point are 1, 0. So we say our x-intercept is 1, 0. Sometimes within ALEX, it might want you to just enter the x value, which is fine. And so that happens when x is 1. That's where we are intersecting the x-axis. For part F, it wants us to find the y-intercept. For our y-intercept, we are crossing the y-axis only right here, which is 0, -1. So you can see when our x-intercept, we have a y value equals 0. For our y-intercept, we have our x equals 0. And that's happening at 0, -1. Again, Alex might just have you put the y value and say -1. Okay, and then for our last two questions, it's asking us for the domain and the range. So for part G, for our domain, that's looking at our x values, our inputs. So what are all the possible inputs for our function? Normally that means I look from the left to the right, like is there a wall on the left, a wall on the right, like what's going on there? And so if you look on the left side, we have this arrow, meaning it's going to go forever left. So that's going towards -infinity. On the right side, because we have this little dot here, that's a stopper. So we stop at this x value of 4. So we're going to go all the way from -infinity to 4. But notice that our graph breaks here, but that's actually okay because it looks like at -3 there's a hole, which would normally mean you don't include -3. But then you can see it's filled in down below. So our domain for this function is actually going to be -infinity. You do not have to stop at -3 because you're including it. That's what I have that little bracket for. So it's going to go actually all the way up to 4, and it does touch at that value. There's a y value here, or x value here. This is 4, -3. So that is an element of the domain. The last thing that we have is the range. And so, h actually. So for our range, that's our y values, or our possible outputs. And so again, I'm going to erase my picture a little bit. Let's see what we have here. So for my range, that's from the bottom to the top. Like, how low does this graph go to how high? So you can see that the lowest point that we have is going to be right here, which is a y value of -4. And it does include that value because the point -3, -4 is on the graph. So -4 is the lowest value, and it's included, so I put the parenthesis. And then we want to know, well, how high does it go? So we have this graph, it's going, and then look, there's like this space here where there's no outputs. So between 0 and 1, there's no outputs. So that means we're going to look at that point being the highest, which is a y value of 0, and it does touch there, even though there wasn't a dot. Again, you could kind of see that was like kind of labeled on there. It does actually touch. And then you can see that this is a constant function, just a horizontal line. So we're going to say, okay, well, it is all the numbers between -4 and 0, but then it's also all those that have a y value of 1. And so that's just 1. It's not an interval of numbers like this one is. So we're going to just say union, and then we could put these curly braces. And so that should be the range of your function. So hope that helps. Any more questions, please post it here or send me an email.